All right, hi folks. This is Scott Powell once again, the historian and teacher at Knowable World. This is our ongoing student interview series that I hope you've been catching on our YouTube channel. We've had interviews on the history of China and on the history of Japan. And now we have a new series coming up here on the history of India. And Mikaela's been regaling us with her awareness of these important cultures. We're studying Asia, Africa, and the world we live in at Knowable World. We just, in fact, finished the academic year. We've got Memorial Day coming up. And so we've covered China, Japan, the Islamic world, India, and sub-Saharan Africa. You can't find this with any other history program. And the other thing that you can't find with any other history program for homeschoolers or for anybody else is the present-centric approach to history that we take at Knowable World. For those of you adults out there that are interested in it, you can read my book, The History of Now, and the sequel, The History of Tomorrow, and that will give you some insight into the approach. The key is that we treat history as not merely as the study of the past, but rather as the revelation and explanation of the world we live in. So, Mikaela, you know the drill. In order to initiate the proper study of any historical topic, we need to get our mind wrapped around the fact that it's the world we want to understand and India's role in it that we want to understand. So, what's the world we live in, for starters?
The world we live in is an interconnected agglomeration of nearly 200 countries that can be broken up into 10 major cultural blocks, 5 of which are cardinal cultures, in which the United States has primacy.
Okay, folks, I want you to notice the hierarchy of that. The 200, which is a plethora that most people get stuck with rote memorizing. And then we have these 10 cultural blocks that we can organize it into. And I'll show you a map to give you a little clue as to how that works. And then there's 5 cardinal cultures. Mikaela, remind people what we mean by that.
A cardinal culture is a culture that has a certain level of influence over history. To break it down simply, they are a culture with both the will to change the world and the capability to.
Okay. And then we have American primacy, the fact that everybody out there, of course, has to deal with, right? All the cultures of the world, whether it's Russia invading Ukraine or Israel fighting for its survival against Hamas or China pondering the possibility of invading Taiwan, everybody always has to ask themselves, what will America do? And India, where does India sit within the hierarchy of these 200, the 10, the 5, the 1?
India is a major culture.
Okay, and so not quite cardinal culture. Just give us a little bit of an explanation of where India sits in terms of, let's actually start with an anchor fact, right? Because that's our approach. The present-centric method of history centers around anchor facts. So India, what's our first anchor fact for studying the history of India today? And what kind of culture is it ever since that milestone?
First anchor fact is 1947, where India gained independence from Britain. Alongside, there was the partition of India and Pakistan. This has led the culture to be post-colonial in the modern day.
Okay, so let's talk post-colonial. What is that? Because we've talked about post-Maoist China. It used to be Maoist, is no longer. We've talked about post-imperial. Japan used to be an empire, is no longer. Okay, so post-colonial in a way is pretty straightforward, but talk a little bit about that.
Well, post-colonial is after being part of a colony, but what specifically is displayed in it is that they are in the period of being after a colony, but they do not have anything else besides that, despite the fact that they have been independent for, what's the math, 80 plus years?
Yeah,
Not 80.
nearly 80 years, right? Okay. And so post-colonial also, whenever we're in a post framework with regard to a culture, what we mean is it was something and it hasn't quite defined an identity yet. Is India trying to define a new identity? What's it working towards?
Yes, India is very much attempting to define an identity based on their Hindu culture, and they're trying to hone it through Hinduva or Hindu nationalism.
All right. That's tricky though, because is there such a thing as Hinduism?
No, there is not, because the idea of Hinduism is an exonym. It is an idea that we impose onto India from the West, that we like to have these isms, which are integrated sets of ideas. But Hinduism, in and of itself, is not integrated. It encompasses such a wide spectrum of beliefs and practices that it is not something that we can impose that sort of definition onto, because that all takes root in their early history of having a unintegrated Hindu culture.
Okay, so to help people that are not familiar with Hinduism, I think the best way to arrive at just an initial understanding of what Hindu culture is, because it's not Hinduism, is to compare it to ancient Greece. Because the ancient Greeks did not have an integrated set of religious beliefs. What they had was a pantheon of gods: Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, and so on, and all kinds of different rituals as practiced by a variety of city-states. And India is very much the same way. In other words, it's a collection, a miscellany of small cultures that never really became one culture. And so there is no Hinduism. In fact, the Supreme Court of India actually made the definitive statement on this point and said there is no such thing as Hinduism. Hindu culture is a way of life, and it is a very broad spectrum of beliefs. So if you want to build a Hindu nation, you're going to have trouble doing that on the basis of Hindu culture. But there are other factors as well, right? So we're going to talk about political history, but one of the things that reflects that is the incredible diversity of India. It's hard for people to grasp. It's a very large place. Most projections have a tendency to exaggerate the geographical size of things in the northern hemisphere. People ascribe all kinds of reasons to that, but it's not really important. It just makes it hard for us to understand how big and diverse India is. How about linguistically? That's a really interesting clue right there, right? So what is India in terms of a nation when it comes to a language? That's one of the most fundamental things that binds a nation together, is everybody speaks the same language. Is that the case in India?
No, well, sort of. As for when accounting for native Indian languages, there are so many that you can barely even count them all. Depending on which region you go to, you will encounter a different language, and generally it's kind of a mess in that regard. But when accounting for the language that they all speak, they're not very satisfied with it because it's not one of their own native Indian languages. It is English, which originates from their time of being a British colony.
Right, exactly. So this is another issue when it comes to the post-colonial predicament of India, that basically the only language that's widely spoken across India is English, the colonial language. So do you build a culture around that? I mean, you have to, in a sense, you have to build it around democracy. India has the most people of any country in the world, more than China, and it's growing rapidly, whereas China is shrinking. So this is a very complex place. I'm just going to pin this down for our listeners here. In fact, India, by some accounts, has a total of 1,652 distinct languages and 22 major languages that are spoken by tens of millions of people. And those are distinct. So try to imagine it's as easily as diverse as Europe in terms of major languages, and much more diverse in terms of dialects and sub-languages and so on. So how do you build a nation out of that? Well, let's talk about that now, Mikaela, because okay, you don't have an integrated set of religious beliefs. You don't have a language that you can build your nation on. So Hindutva says we're going to have a Hindu culture. Oh, but wait a minute. Also, what are the other factors? What would a culture normally build its national identity on in light of previously having been colonized? What would it be based on?
It would be based on their original incarnation that they were before being colonized.
Okay, as we're going to learn now, right, because we're going to dive into that history, it can't be done. So when we circle back around to this, we're going to see why India has been struggling for nearly 80 years now to define a new national identity and path forward, and what's holding it back. Because as the most populous nation in the world, as a nuclear power, as a country that it's really starting to become economically very significant. We don't yet have a made in India revolution to match that of made in China, but nonetheless, it's emerging, and India seems to be forging a pretty positive relationship with the Trump administration. So there are signs that economically India could really emerge as a very important part of the world. But in order to have a united culture, one of the things you got to rely on is your history. So, Mikaela, let's now go back to what should we call it? We call it the second anchor fact because we always start with the present. But, that fundamental datum of Indian history is what? And why is this going to be such a liability to creating a national culture?
Well, when we go back to our, second, first, depending on how you categorize it, anchor fact, it kind of doesn't really exist at the same time that it does. We don't really have a date for it. We quite literally use a question mark, question mark, question mark, or there's four, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, to symbolize the Indus Valley civilization.
Yeah. Okay. So in other words, we've got 4 digits there because we know it's ancient. It's thousands of years BC. But we literally can't say something like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. It's that impossible to pin down. So with regard to ancient Egypt, for instance, we can say Menes-Narmer unified Egypt circa 3000 BC. That's okay as a milestone. It's very vague, and there are multiple chronologies for ancient Egypt. So therefore, that's the best we can do with, plus or minus a couple hundred, right? So that's still history. We put a circa there to say, all right, it's fuzzy. And that's not unheard of. In fact, that's very normal that the origin points of various cultures, such as ancient Greece, circa 776 BC, any culture, China, circa 2200 BC. It's always circa. It's always like, it's fuzzy. But with India, we can't even give a circa, which means around. Right? We got to just say question mark, question mark, question mark, question. We don't know. Hindu culture, Indus Valley civilization or Harappan civilization basically had no history. Let's talk more about that. What was that original culture like?
Well, the original culture was we called Hindu culture because it involved a lot of the Hindu practices that have lived till now. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot we can say about it because it was both ahistorical and unintegrated. Ahistorical meaning that they never recorded any of their own history. They recorded their religious stories, but that's all we have to base off of. Those aren't facts that we can construct a history out of. They were never politically integrated. They were a patchwork of different kingdoms and tribes, and sometimes an empire would arise, but because of a lack of history, after their inevitable fall, there would be no distinct, lasting impact afterward.
Okay, right. So 2 really important things here. Ahistorical, they just, as a culture, they never recorded their own history. And politically unintegrated, meaning they never made that leap up to being a single culture. So in our next segment, we'll turn to the question of what's our first datum? What can we possibly say about the origins of Indian history? Okay, so Hindu culture, we don't know when it starts. There's no way to know. You've got the Ramayana, you've got these epics, you've got the famous Bhagavad Gita and so on. And all that's religious and poetic and it's literature and it's fascinating. But it doesn't give us any history at all. When do we actually encounter some specificity, some historicity with regard to India's story?
Well, very first would be the arrival of Alexander the Great in circa 327 BC. He comes on his journey to build his own empire and encounters this disintegrated India. This does not leave any kind of impact on India as a culture. However, it does give us a little bit of perspective. It parts the clouds, if you will, to let us see through and get an idea of what India was really like at that point. It gives us a little bit of history for India when there was none actually originating from them directly.
Mm-hmm.
And Essentially, that's the purpose it serves.
Yeah, right. It just says, oh, look, something happened, and we know that it happened, and we know when it happened, and who was doing it. Oh, my goodness. Okay, so that's it. And then, as you say, it's kind of like this somebody comes into this dark cave, and all of a sudden, they shine a light, and you can see the contours of the cave for a moment, and then the battery starts to fade, and everything goes back to darkness. So momentarily, we can see something called the Maurya Empire thereafter, which was from circa 322 to 185. I don't ask my students to memorize that. That is just my responsibility as a historian, right? But we see temporarily this Maurya Empire, very strange empire that was actually undone ultimately by a Buddhist emperor who just basically gave up on warfare. And very strange, Ashoka was his name. And so that's why Buddhism never became dominant in India, because a lot of Buddhism says, even though it started in India, Buddhism is generally kind of a pacifist type of mentality, even though there can be strains of Buddhism that are warlike. But basically, that empire didn't last. And again, the Buddhism of the emperors didn't transmit. Buddhism ended up going to China and then later on to Korea and Japan, but it didn't last in India itself. Hindu culture continued to be the baseline. And again, it goes dark, right? The story goes dark. So when does the next bright flash of historicity arise?
It arose in circa 711 AD with the arrival of the Islamic Empire that was rapidly expanding. They came to conquer India in 4 major waves. However, they didn't conquer the majority of India. Their impact today can mostly be seen through the Islamization of Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Aha. So we're going to come back to that when we talk about independence and partition back in 1947, right? When we finally circle around there. Right. So circa 711, that's kind of an interesting date.
That was also the beginning of the Reconquista.
In Iberia. So basically, that caliphate that was started by Muhammad and then his caliphs expanded very rapidly. And in 711, they entered into Iberia and India at the same time. And so that's a really important date for history in that regard, and really an anchor fact of Islamic history. And so India experienced multiple waves of invasion. And the first one is the most consequent because it resulted in Pakistan becoming predominantly Muslim and then eventually becoming a country separate from India. Later on, as you said, one of those waves also went down the Ganges River Valley and resulted in the Islamization of Bangladesh. We'll get to that again as well. And so the Muslims are coming, wave after wave after wave, and that's the dominant theme of Indian history after 711. But India is not just subordinate to Islam in this phase of its history, which of course it's not terribly fond of because it's just one of those examples of how India has been dominated by other cultures. It's not a very pleasant reality to ponder all the time. But we got to continue anyway. So where do we go in terms of anchor facts?
Well, we go to, finally, some solid ones. Vasco da Gama, who had circumnavigated Africa and gotten all the way to India, being the first European to arrive in India via this method.
Mm-hmm.
The other anchor fact being 1526, the rise of the Mughal Empire in India, which is another Islamic empire, but instead of only really having an impact in Pakistan and Bangladesh, or modern day Bangladesh, instead ruled over the vast majority of what we know today as India.
Right. So we call that a tandem anchor fact, because basically we're talking about we need to anchor our awareness of the fact that India was dominated by the Muslims and Europeans. So 1526 specifically is the Battle of Panipat, in which the Mughal Empire was established, it conquered Delhi and then the surrounding region, and it started to grow. Architecturally, what are some of the symbols of Islamic domination of India?
Well, we see today that a lot of the original Hindu temples in the area were destroyed by the Mughal Empire, and their bricks were used to build minarets or which were places of religious significance that were used to call to prayer. Another really major one is the Taj Mahal, which is the most famous building in India, despite the fact that it is a result of Islamic rule.
Yeah, right. It's a tomb for Shah Jahan, a Mughal emperor, and his wife. And you can see the minarets, right? They are the feature of Islamic culture, really a symbol of Islamic triumphalism. If you go to Constantinople, well, which is now Istanbul, well, there you go again. You see the Hagia Sophia, which was a Christian cathedral, and now it's flanked by 4 minarets. So it's a mosque, right? So when you see the minarets, it tells you everything. For those of you listening, you can Google the Qutb minaret, Qutb, and this is a symbol of Islamic triumphalism found near Delhi. And basically, it was built out of the bricks of multiple Hindu temples. So this is really, historically, architecturally, in so many ways, the story of India is the story of being dominated by other cultures. But we do the tandem anchor fact, 1498, 1526, because of the pairing of the arrival of the 2 cultures. And one of those is going to become dominant. So we'll turn to that in our next segment. Okay, so the Portuguese were the first to arrive, 1498. They had an incredibly lucrative trade in Asia. The Portuguese were also the first to arrive in Japan. And so they were the middlemen of Europe for a while. But Portugal is a very small country, and there's no way that it could stand up to all of its rivals in Europe. So eventually you get the Dutch and also the French and the British in particular, right, or the English up until a certain point. So let's talk about them, their arrival and their role in Indian history.
This was ultimately a competition between Britain and France to decide who was going to take over India or who was going to have the most influence there. And this was decided by the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 63. This mostly occurred over in America. The 7 Years' War mainly resulted in Britain seizing control of Canada, which was originally colonized by France. And over and in India, Britain began its encroach onto the Mughal Empire. This mostly came in the form of East India companies, which struck deals with local rajas or princes to expel Mughal rulers in return for their company control over certain areas. The British were really good at taking over places, and next thing they knew, they expanded all across India. This led to the Government of India Act in 1858, which officially declared Britain as the rulers of India.
Right, so India went from company rule, as you say, to being the British Raj. All right, so that's our next momentous phase of history. So we have the invasion of Alexander the Great. We have the Muslim invasions, repeated Muslim invasions. And then we have the invasion by Britain. And these are the milestones of Indian history. Even though there are every once in a while these flashes of native empires, they never last. Political integration does not occur. It really only ever occurs in a lasting way because of the British. Let's talk about the British mode of colonialism in India. This is very significant, and certainly India could not be a country today were it not for the influence, the impact of the British on their culture. What did the British do during the period of the Raj?
The British practiced a form of imperialism that is known as tutelary imperialism, meaning their intention was to educate the culture that they were ruling rather than integrate it as an extension of Britain itself. It wanted them to eventually be able to engage in self-rule and build up their government and add stability to these cultures. This mainly came in the form of, first of all, establishing a democratic government, a railroad system across India to integrate it for the first real time, and also a system of schools to educate the people, alongside offering the opportunity for more wealthy Indians to send their children to Britain to be educated.
And of course, who's the most famous student that made his way to England?
Mohandas Gandhi.
Right. Okay. Right. So yeah, tutelary imperialism. It's a fascinating phenomenon because the British certainly did brutal things, and we're never going to excuse that. Their conquest was a conquest, and every act of colonization was always, to some extent, an act of warfare, an act of violence, for sure. And that includes the native tribes of America and any other place. Africa, we will probably get to this summer as well and talk about that. Okay, but the British have so much that can be said on their behalf at the same time. That's what makes history interesting, is it's not simple, it's complex, it's, as people like to say today, nuanced. So basically, tutelary imperialism is a fascinating phenomenon. Without it, basically India would never have become politically or culturally integrated. So they can thank the British if they're in a generous mood on any given day. And so, all right, we've got the British Raj. What's going to happen to it is, of course, the big question. Let's turn to that. Okay, Mikaela, so we've mentioned Mohandas Gandhi and the fact that the British Raj eventually came to an end. So let's talk about the Swaraj movement and the famous concept of satyagraha and how did that all pan out? Go ahead.
Swaraj is a word that basically means self-determination, primarily towards self-rule or independence of India. This occurred mostly through the efforts of Mohandas Gandhi, who engaged in a type of non-violent resistance known as satyagraha. He believed that he and his followers could convince the British to see the error of their ways and bestow India their independence peacefully. This is mostly shown by quite a few movements that he engaged in, one of which involved him weaving his own clothes. The British system made it so that they would collect cotton and the base materials for making clothing from India, ship them over to Britain, make the clothes, and sell them at a higher price to native Indians.
Okay, right? And so actually this is in common between America and India as two cultures that were under British rule. And the response was the same, right? What we call homespun, right? So Mohandas Gandhi is often shown kind of famously as spinning his own clothes. And the whole idea is we're going to make our own clothing. We're not going to participate in the imperial economic system. Okay, and what was the other famous one that kind of along the same lines?
The Salt March, which occurred in 1930. It was a similar situation where sea salt was monopolized by the British. It was illegal to make your own sea salt. You just had to buy the British version. And so Gandhi organized a movement where he marched 240, give or take, miles out to the ocean to collect a handful of sea salt to symbolically show protest against the British.
Yeah, the idea is we have salt right here. Why do we need to buy it in a British store as part of the imperial economy, right? So these were forms of protest that were nonviolent. It's very interesting because the idea of satyagraha is a difficult concept to gauge, historically speaking. In my view, it can work sometimes, and it did partially work with regard to the independence of India. And that's precisely because of the moral nature of British culture. That's what Gandhi was banking on. Can you think of, this is a tough question, but I bet you can do it. Can you think of examples in which satyagraha would just completely fail?
Well, most other empires it would completely fail. Everybody knows the horrors of the Nazis and that empire. There's no way non-violent resistance would do anything to discourage them.
Right. I mean, the Jews were nonviolent, and they were rounded up and they were exterminated to the tune of 6 million people, right? So satyagraha was not going to have any moral impact on the Nazis because they were so fundamentally immoral. Satyagraha would not have worked against the Japanese Empire either, which was slaughtered people at Nanking and just, wow, it just was ruthless, right? So in other words, Satyagraha could only work, and it only did partially work, in relation to a culture that was fundamentally moral, but it was challenged, it was compromised. Its imperialism was not benevolent fully, and so therefore you could try to tap into the moral sense of the British and say, look, these are terrible things that you're doing to us. Gandhi was imprisoned, and a lot of his followers were imprisoned, and the British eventually were really ashamed of this. Again, gauging the efficacy of this is not easy to do, because really, India's independence did not come through Satyagraha. What happened? How did it become independent?
Well, to mark the end, more or less, of Satyagraha, we can look at what they engaged in during World War II. As part of the British Empire, Indians were expected to participate on the side of Britain. And given that this was not their war, Gandhi began engaging in the Quit India movement, where he rallied the rest of the Indians and told them to refuse to go to war instead. This led to, well, Gandhi himself being imprisoned till he was let out, mostly on the basis that he had gotten sick and they didn't want him to die a martyr. In the end, this effort didn't stop the British from drafting the Indian people. The actual end of British rule came in the form of Britain's state after World War II. They could no longer sustain their empire. It was massive. And they were so terribly beaten that they gave all their former colonies their independence, which India achieved in 1947.
So it's basically the British were exhausted. They're like, okay, we're turning this over to you, right? So we're circling back around here in terms of anchor facts. So we have the independence of India. Alongside of that, what happened?
The partition as well. As we have discussed previously, both Pakistan and Bangladesh were both Islamic. And if India were to be given independence, with those two territories included, it would end up with an overwhelming Hindu majority who had, not too long ago in their history, been conquered by these people. It would have inevitably led to the majority oppressing the minority. So, in order to prevent this, the British split off Pakistan and Bangladesh, which was at the time known as East Pakistan. They were the same thing. But however, this was a very difficult situation because the Hindus who were in Pakistan couldn't stay there because they didn't want to be oppressed, and the Muslims inside of India had the same predicament. So it led to a mass migration with, I want to say, millions of people crossing the borders, and it was a mess. It was a mess.
So this is one of the harsh realities of history, and especially of tutelary empires like Britain. They have tough decisions to make, and we're often very critical of them. Same thing happened in 1948 in Palestine, because basically the British said, we're going to draw some lines, and we're going to have a Muslim country, and we're going to have a Jewish country, and of course, same catastrophe, war, because the solution was not accepted by either side. In India, or in South Asia, the solution generally was accepted. Mohandas Gandhi was, one of the advocates of independence. Muhammad Jinnah was the Muslim advocate for the formation of Pakistan. And so they were kind of allies, or temporary allies, against the British. But truly what they knew was that these cultures could not coexist. So if they were all lumped into one country, inevitably it would have been civil war and a total disaster. So did the British do a perfect job? No. But did they do a pretty good job? I actually think they did an okay job. I mean, given the level of difficulty of the problem. And so from that point onward, we have these post-colonial cultures. Pakistan, not so much, because its Muslim identity is obvious and clear. As you said, Bangladesh was part of Pakistan until they busted out in one of the Indo-Pak wars, right? So the Indo-Pakistani wars are a feature of the post-colonial reality following 1947. We just had one. Many people might not know there just was one. So it wasn't one of the big ones, but basically there just was one because there was a terrible terrorist attack in Kashmir that killed dozens of people, and then they started exchanging fire. Now, that's really dangerous today. Why?
Because both India and Pakistan today are nuclear cultures.
They're nuclear powers. So basically, if they really get into a terrible hot war, they could annihilate each other. And that would mean 1.5 billion dead. Never mind the ecological catastrophe of the world being inundated with everything from the atomic bombs, right? So it would be a total disaster. So they opted not to do that. They're smart enough. All the world's nuclear powers, since the dropping of the bombs on Japan, have been smart enough to say, we're not going to use these things. They're basically a deterrent, and they prevent larger wars, which is a good thing. We have the very difficult scenario right now of Russia-Ukraine war, in which there could be a nuclear exchange. That's really scary. And then the question of Taiwan is also really scary because the Chinese could be tempted to use nuclear weapons. Whew. So, but luckily, India and Pakistan are not doing that. Okay, so we've circled back around, right? We have this post-colonial reality. What are your thoughts about the prospects for India as a culture, as a major culture, trying to become a cardinal culture?
India is in a tough spot. They're trying to find their identity after not really having much of any throughout their history. And it seems like the direction they're going with Hindu nationalism is likely not going to work because they're trying to base it off of a history that doesn't really exist. So, in that regard, India's future is kind of messy, it's muddled, but if they manage to find a solid set of answers that actually is beneficial to the culture and actually works, it has a lot of potential to become a cardinal culture. It has a massive population, and it has the opportunity with China's population shrinking to become a major hub for manufacturing and trade. So essentially, to sum it up really fast, it has a lot of potential. It just has to figure out how to use that potential properly.
Yeah, exactly. It's really up in the air. It's been nearly 80 years, which is a long time to wait for a new identity to emerge. And so we don't know. My sense is that Hindu nationalism is kind of going to be the, you know, the virtue signaling aspect of the emergence of India, in the sense of modern cultures are often focused on perception rather than reality. The reality of any potential Indian success is it's going to be based on English, it's going to be based on democracy, and it's going to be based on technology. All things that came to India thanks to the West. So they're not happy about that, but they have to embrace those things. And if they do, they will succeed on that basis. And then, okay, the Hindu aspect will be, you can have your Diwali festival, you can have your different gods and goddesses and march through the streets, and you can have fun with that. It can be recreational, but it can't be foundational as a cultural basis for moving forward. So I think is very pragmatic and knows how to do that. So I'm hoping that that's what's going to happen, and India will in fact emerge as a cardinal culture, well, with China waning and probably Russia and Europe also pretty much on the skids. So it's like, okay, there could be a very interesting world emerging in which India is much more important, which is why we study Indian history, because we are looking at an emergent cardinal culture. I think that is the best way to think of it, and the reason and the motivation for studying it. So thanks, Mikaela. Fascinating story, and as always, well told. So thank you, and hopefully we got one more installment coming on the history of sub-Saharan Africa. So folks, look forward to that. Mikaela is a high school student, so you can see the command that she has on this material. And she's going to be moving on to the advanced history program next year because that's where it's at in terms of really the capstone of a knowable world education. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Okay, Mikaela, thank you. Wonderful job.
Thank you.